Good afternoon. My name is Ben Rawlingson Plant. I'm the Deputy Director of Global Public Affairs, and I'm joined here this afternoon by CYRA LEVENSON. And CYRA is the Deputy Director, and Gail Engelberg, Director of Education and Public Engagement, and we both work at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. And in the middle is JING LIU. Jing is an architect, educator, and co-founder of Soil. We're here today to talk about curating culture post-COVID. This sort of started last summer, this conversation in Fort Greene Park, where Jing and I work and live during the pandemic. And CYRA had just driven across country from Cleveland to come and join us at the Guggenheim. And every Friday evening, we used to convene in the park with friends and talk and drink rosé and come up with ideas, and there were sort of various sort of discussions. And one of the things that we were talking about was this amazing project that Jing has been running in Jackson Heights, and it's part of the Neighborhoods Now program that connects communities hard hit by COVID-19 and puts them together with leading design firms. And Jing, I wonder whether you could just tell us a bit more about this project, how it came about. And
Right. It really started in the beginning of the pandemic, I think in March. Like how we were convening, I was also reaching out and being reached out by a bunch of nonprofit organizations that work in the city, in the urban space, and really thinking together about how can we reach out to some of these communities that we see on the news who are devastated in those early days and didn't know what to do at that moment. How can we reach out and safely help them and tangibly help them to navigate this situation that we were all feeling the heat, but can only imagine how much stress some of these communities were under. So the communities that we went into was Jackson Heights in Queens, and it was the area where the highest mortality rate was found during the first phase of the pandemic. And so we went in there and really helped to distribute PPE and also help to have the community leaders there to understand social distancing. And dimension is what we do as architects. Right. We were trying to map out where they can be with how many people, and many of the small businesses were very, very small. Their footprint were very small. So just letting them know that there are certain business you cannot have people going in there anymore. So that was the first phase, and we worked in there for another year and a half, pretty much until now, and we installed many iterations of street seats, open restaurant program street seats for them, all pro bono, all free of charge, because many of those small businesses, they don't have the capital to even put out for those accommodations. So we helped to connect them with nonprofit organizations and foundations to get that help.
Amazing. Mm-hmm. And I know that this sort of connects back to the Guggenheim, and I can't quite remember what the connection is as a former colleague who started a program in Jackson Heights. Is that right, Sarah? Could you talk a bit?
Yeah, across the city, there was a initiative 6 or 7 years ago, the Guggenheim, called Still Spotting, which is about understanding different kinds of spaces for reflection, among other things, within the city. And Jing and Soil were one of the recipients of funding to do a project in Jackson Heights from the Guggenheim. We are, of course, a very site-specific institution with this kind of unique experience of the rotunda and of iconic Frank Lloyd Wright building, but we're also we've always been a very initiative-driven institution, one that likes to think beyond the walls of the museum itself. And so this project is one of many that the Guggenheim has initiated over time to really engage with the city, the world at large. And to me, coming in new to the institution and returning to New York, it's really important to connect with the fabric of the city, to connect with the historic projects and community partnerships that have existed. And so Jing reached out about this sort of new phase of connection between her work and Jackson Heights, and that coincided with my own thinking about how we make our space, not just a physical space, but also a civic space, and think about this kind of intersection of architecture and equity and the really important conversations that we need to be having in our space, metaphorically and physically. And so since then, we've been talking about how we pick up that through line, that connection that was already made. And I think it's important to say, you know, how respectful I am of the fact that you built those community partnerships and relationships and committed to them past that initial phase of project and partnership. And I think that doesn't happen often enough. And if you really are going to be part of the fabric of the place that you live, it's a long-term connection. It's a long-term commitment. So
it is. And I think one thing that we very much learned along the way is that we can gain so much knowledge from each community's on the ground, because even with something technical like architecture, it's a very lived knowledge. So going into Jackson Heights, obviously it's not the first time I go there to eat quite a bit, but to be, you know, connected to the people on the ground every day in that way, there's so much knowledge that we learned along the way that it would be a waste to have that, you know, relationship to stop just because we're, you know, coming out of the pandemic, so to say.
So is it ongoing, your work?
Yeah, it is ongoing. It is ongoing, but I think some of the more crisis-driven work is trailing down a bit, and that's when CYRA and I started to talk about how can we carry this knowledge and carry this relationship forward, because one of the most important thing I think is to be able to connect the local youth to some of the academic cultural institutions, and then to the design professionals, as well as to the city policymakers and decision makers, so that we can understand. I think many people want our city to work as one, you know, and I think the pandemic has shown that we are one city and we have helped each other. There are a lot of community fridge that are still today very much well stocked, right? So we are trying to help each other, but I think the knowledge and the relationship often is the bottleneck, where the help and the will, right, and the knowledge, there's a gap there. So what we think that the long-term project could be is to really use this relationship and continue to build relationship outreach to the local youth, so that they understand that they can have say in the policy making, have a hand in the urban, you know, space building in the future. So in 10 years, they can be in the position of teaching the next generation in the position in the city to make those decisions. And we also know that a lot of the city policymakers have a bit of gap in understanding how a policy can be adapted in one neighborhood versus the other, and that's very different. So I think with CYRA, we've been talking about what is the structure within which this knowledge exchange can happen, and how can we expand this very valuable connection we've made to, you know, bigger network.
And I would say, I mean, one of the things that is really fundamental that needs to shift in our field and is beginning to shift is to think of another word beside audience for the participants that are part of the work that we do. So we've been thinking quite a bit about sustainability and what does it mean for us to embrace that as a concept. And yes, it is about, you know, energy consumption and some of the very pragmatic details like that, but it's also about, you know, shifting perception about where knowledge lies, where solutions will come from, how do we become expert in what the future will bring. And my answer is by talking to the people who will live in it. Yeah. And I think historically institutions like ours have devalued the perspective of young people, or at least perceived them as somehow the recipient of the information or the knowledge that we have. And one of the shifts that we're trying to make, and this is why I think we have such a good time talking about this, because I see that you're doing that in your field, to shift where we think the knowledge and the expertise lie. I mean, a fundamental principle of human-centered design is that the people who face the problem also know the answer. They need support, they need resources, they need frameworks sometimes, which is what I see your practice being about, and that's something that we can provide. But we've made the shift in this last year for all from our teen programs all the way up through our college programs, our graduate student programs, that we are paying all of the students who work with us, and we are inviting them to help us understand what it is that they want and need from an institution like ours as part of their life as New Yorkers and as part of their professional future. So because of the legacy of thinking differently about space at the Guggenheim, again, to me that means that we have a mandate to go beyond the confines of our building and to think with other people who are shifting what that field will look like.
Right.
I think another sort of connection between all of us is the sort of the global and the local, and CYRA and our whole institution had to suddenly shift to local when the pandemic happened, and when eventually we reopened last October the museum. We hadn't really sort of considered our local sort of visitors, and something we're really determined to do is put down sort of more roots in local communities, which is why it's really great that you two are talking. But we've also got the global. So the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation covers New York, Bilbao, Venice, and soon to be Abu Dhabi. So how do we sort of bring that all together? And I know, Sarah, you've run a few programs that cross what we call the constellation of museums. So it'd be really good if you could just tell us a bit about that.
Certainly. And again, the thread here is also young people and students in particular. And I think that a really important reframing that we need to do is to understand that there is not a conflict between a local and a global conversation or dialogue or even institution. It's one of the other things that Jing and I talk frequently about, is that Jackson Heights is as much, if not more, of a global location.
There's 173 languages spoken. It is officially the most diverse zip code on Earth.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So it, to me, is a very logical connection that an institution like ours that has locations in different places and considers itself global would partner with a neighborhood like Jackson Heights, which is the most international place that we could work in the city of New York and in fact beyond. And that to have a partner who has already built trust and built partnerships there makes a lot of sense. So what we were working on during the pandemic was to connect the students from our 4 sites who are college students interested in and focused on sustainability and equity. And we engaged them in a process called world building with a partner named Tony Patrick. And world building is, I think, a really sort of productive way to borrow a technique that comes from game design, science fiction, film scores. So if you think about the great movies that you've seen, the story unfolds within a universe. It unfolds within a place. It's not just a set of characters, right? It's a whole rethink of the container, the structure for that. We need a whole rethink of the container for our actions if we're going to address the climate crisis, create more equity, create different kind of listening, different kind of knowing, different kind of solutions. It's not that those solutions don't exist, it's that they need to be heard and they need to be seen. So we've been engaging with students across our constellation to use this technique of world building to imagine what a more sustainable cultural infrastructure museum practice would look like in the year 2041. And it's really astounding, some of the things that they came up with. And that's going to guide us as we develop future programs moving into the future.
So interesting. And Jing, are you a part of that discussion as well? Or?
I had the privilege to attend one of the world building sessions, and I did have 2 ideas, I remember.
Let's hear them.
It was intimidating amongst all the young people who I felt that they knew probably better what to do.
I mean, it's a sort of similar to the way sort of CYRA is sort of thinking. I mean, your practice, even though you're based here in New York, Seoul Architects, I mean, you work all around the world, and I know that you have projects going on in China and other parts of the world. And how do you sort of marry the two?
Yeah, and then I think as you were talking about the global and the local, indeed, those are not two completely, they're often pitted against each other as two different conditions, but they're really not. I think, there are social economical issues. For example, we should not understand the globetrotter, citizens as Jackson Heights, Although there's a lot of people movement in Jackson Heights, a neighborhood like that, and people do move around between countries quite a bit. But there are very different socioeconomic differences there. But I think with the pandemic, before the pandemic, like many other architects, we were traveling all the time, going from one project to the other. And then think of the energy of being able to talk with different cultures, different perspectives, was very much led to us establishing a kind of global practice, and that needed to continue. And that was kind of the initial, just impulse for us to go to Jackson Heights, to still be exposed to the others, because we were all, having rosé in Fort Greene is nice, but sometimes you also need to be confronted with the other cultures and the other voice and the other way of looking at things. And I think working in Jackson Heights, I think really, in a way, fulfilled almost the same urge that we had in going to other places and make architecture. And part of the making of the architecture, as you probably know, that we need to talk with all walks of life. We need to talk with lawyers, we need to talk with local communities, we need to talk with builders, we need to talk with business owners on the street. So I think the experience was able to continue with this work, I felt.
So some sort of positive things to have come out of, other than the fact we all got together and got to know each other and work with each other. And you two are also germinating sort of around more sort of projects actually within the museum, is that right? To do with our reading room? Could you just talk a bit to that?
Yeah, certainly. This is a free-ranging conversation, so. I was learning more about Jing's practice and her way of thinking about the discipline and the rigor with which she thinks about this space and the way people use it. I asked her for feedback and to give some perspective on how we could activate the spaces of the Guggenheim, not necessarily the exhibition spaces, which we're really well-versed at activating, but the building has a bunch of quirky stairwells, a couple of phone booths, which are actually landmarked and haven't been touched, save for the fact that there's no longer phones in them, but there are phone books there. There's the spaces in the cafe. There's all these sort of interstitial spaces throughout the museum, inside the museum, and then in fact also on the outside of the museum. If you haven't noticed before, the sidewalk has the same circular pattern in the cement as you would see inside the building. So the whole site was conceived by Frank Lloyd Wright as an experience. And I think people perceive that, but they don't necessarily know that they're perceiving it. And it's really important to me in the job that I do, thinking about public engagement, that we make sure that everybody who comes in the door feels welcome. And we know that that's not yet the case. And so I asked Jing for feedback, especially as I was thinking about these spaces beyond the ramps of the rotunda that are well-known and well-traveled. One of which is a tiny room off of the second ramp that is a keyhole-shaped doorway, which we'd used as a library or a reading room. But it had a sort of stuffy, I should say, it didn't have the most welcoming kind of vibe when I first visited. And I had the sense that we could do more with it, and that it sort of punctuates the experience of walking up and down the ramps in a really unique way. It's the only space besides the cafe where you can sort of exit, reflect, pause.
Was it designed as a reading room?
It was designed.
I sort of just stumbled across it myself, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, it was. I think maybe originally.
It originally was not.
Right, it was like an archive. It was an archival space, and then it became, thought of as a reading room space. But it just I felt it had potential. And so Jing and a colleague actually came up with a really, really useful framework for just thinking about all these different spaces, and I wonder if you would share that.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think everyone knows the rotunda very well. It's the space where you're supposed to connect to the cosmic, and in our discovery of some of the older drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright, the original drawings, you could see that there's the rotunda, but then there's there are all these other spaces that are actually not that disconnected. And it's only in the recent plans that you see the figure of the rotunda so clearly legible and kind of disconnected from the rest of the space, like the phone booth or the reading room or even the bathroom, for example. They feel like they're a little bit of confetti at this moment, but because a lot of the bathroom before were sliding doors, so they were more kind of connected in that way that everyday and the cosmic are connected. So we started to call those little nooks and crannies the everyday space. Yes. And then the center as this kind of a transcendent cosmic space that's collective, and really understanding the relationship between the two, and how do we make that a bit more porous and more playful. And I think one of the proposal, I mean, many of these are just kind of catalytic thinking, was to expand the reading room to the previously kind of in-between space between the rotunda and the reading room. And maybe that doesn't have a hole or door into the rotunda, but maybe it has a view into something else. Maybe a view into Jackson Heights, how everyone is living as we speak, or a view into some classroom in another parts of the city where they're looking at the Guggenheim collection or show or something. So it becomes maybe a portal to something else.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So what we're doing with it now, as thanks in part to just helping to rethink this idea of the cosmic and the sort of personal or interpersonal, is in relation to the exhibition that's up now of Kandinsky and Atel Adnan being an artist who's also a poet. We have a whole series of her works in the form of books available for the public to read. And then we crafted an invitation to come in and either transcribe a poem or draw a poem or write your own on a bookmark and leave it for other people in the room to take home with them. And at first we thought that that people would just sort of hide them in the books, but we are getting so many people. And we had 2,000 people come through this tiny space, which is, probably the size of the stage, barely. That we have a whole stack now, and just the generosity and also that instinct to participate when you're invited to on a human scale,
which presumably we, the Guggenheim, don't normally encourage.
Yes, I think it's new for us to ask people to actually participate. So on the text to the wall text when you enter the room, there's a quote from the artist Atel Adnan. I'm going to try to get this right. I write what I see and I paint what I know. And then we say, join the conversation among artists, because we have two on display and they're also both in dialogue with the building itself. And it's really gratifying to see how people are taking up that invitation and how hungry people are to feel like they can be part of. Not, again, this is the same concept of moving past audience to another kind of notion of what it means to visit a space like this and become part of it and have us be changed as a result of your presence there, which is, I think, connected to the work that you're doing also.
Yeah, I mean, as CYRA was talking about it, I was just thinking that it is our responsibility as architects to make spaces where people intuitively and subconsciously feel that they can be there and that they're invited. And, it is our responsibility to do that in the way we draw the steps and the way we draw those walls, the way we give a view versus not give a view, right? I think all of that is the conversation we've had.
And the importance of public for you, Jing, is sort of very, very sort of clear. And I'm not sure it's something that every architect speaks of, sort of, how they have sort of public at the center of their practice.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Where did that come from? Are we getting to the autobiographical part of I obviously, you can read into it. I'm Chinese, so, growing up thinking, and I left China actually before it became very capitalized. I left in the early 90s, so the China I know was the 70s and 80s, and the community was very important because you shared the same kitchen, you shared the same bathroom, you know, you had to be a community, you had to negotiate, and there was a sense of, you know, someone's going to be there for you when things go wrong. Right, and I think for me to carry that through even the current work and our work in Jackson Heights, I was feeling really, disconnected at that moment. I felt that, well, you know, I actually don't know so many parts. I know they exist, so many parts of the city, and I'm reading it on the news all the time, right? Like, and seeing it on TV all the time, and the ability to be able to go there and connect and also learn from other people than the people that we see every day, was for me a very good way to reconnect it to how I grew up, I guess. Yeah.
And what about you, Sarah? You're sort of
that's a really good question. Why do I do it?
Basically.
Well, there's also something that's occurring to me while we're talking, which is that both my daughters were born in Jackson Heights because I lived there for 5 years, the last time that I lived in New York. And so I'm sure that there's a way that I'm interested in and understand that space from being there every day that perhaps would be different if I didn't have that experience. And it also seemed so obvious to me as a place we would look to for partnership when joining a global institution. I've been working in museums and education and public engagement for probably 25 years at this point. And I chose museums as a kind of institutional home because you get paid to learn what artists do and what they think. And I started off as an artist and felt that, you know, there's a unique way of approaching the world when you can envision that your own making can make a physical change and that you can sort of create something concrete that's inside to share with other people and then have a dialogue based on that. And that seemed to me the core of everything, the fastest way to make connection, the fastest way to explore the fullest sense of what it means to live in a human body. That, you know, we have this really refined perceptual skills, and I have the concern that we're using less and less of them as we become less and less comfortable with each other and in our own bodies and in the world at large, and that worries me about our humanity, actually. And so, you know, I'm hoping that by doing this kind of work from an institution that's designed to fully exercise your senses and to encourage you to make use of them, we can maybe make a small contribution to, you know, helping people feel that their bodies do know how to connect and how to kind of understand the importance of our physical world and the physical space that we share. And that isn't, I don't say all of that with, I hope it doesn't sound too kind of, you know, Pollyanna-ish. But I really think that we have a crisis that requires us to be able to perceive and to be uncomfortable and to sit with that and to understand how other people see things differently than we do, and to be able to make that bridge and to be able to make the shifts and the changes. And I've seen people do that when they're talking about a work of art in a way that I haven't seen in any other way. So I remain optimistic, and I guess that's why I do what I do.
Good answer.
Thank you.
I was just going, we've got a couple of minutes left. Jing, sort of like hopes for a post-COVID world. I mean, lessons that you feel that we have learned as a society, and
I feel that as a society and as an individual, we've each learned so much during this last year and a half. Just our relationship with our families and our relationship with our staff, you know, how to care for our staff, and our relationship to our communities and cities. And I do think that indeed a lot of the questions that we feel face as a society these days, like climate crisis or pandemics probably will continue, as well. All of that require us maybe to reconnect to some of the fundamental experiences and the fundamental principles and values as human beings. As a practice, we've been also recently working quite a bit with Aboriginal communities in Australia and the Indigenous communities in the States, in the kind of northeast of the States. And just talking to them, you also realize that, as human beings, we knew so much about to just use less things and take care of our forest. And it's not that complicated. There's a lot of technical things to overcome the modern, world that we have built. But at the core of it, a lot of these principles are not complicated. Mm-hmm. And to be able to reconnect to them, I think is one of the key things in us ability to deal with some of these larger issues that we're facing today.
I think that's it. I'd just like to thank our global audience. I wish people were here, that they could sort of participate in this discussion, because that's what we like. But thank you very much, myself, CYRA, and Jing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.